Recently, it seems like everyone and their nan has been complaining about how difficult it is to have a good conversation online, or they've opined about how hatred and animosity proliferate beyond all reason in the internet sphere. And I find that so often these discussions end by just declaring that the internet is bad and evil and then moving on. But if we're ever going to change it, we need to understand why it is that the internet seems to make us so very angry at one another. And we need to do this without drifting into overly simplistic thinking or stirring up a mere moral panic. So today, we're going to look at a number of philosophers who I think can help us understand our predicament and hopefully work towards solving it. As always, if there are any corrections, they'll be in the pinned comment. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The Dehumanizing Human. One thing I want to acknowledge right off the bat is that while I do think that certain dynamics of the internet can intensify our hostility towards one another, we ought not think that the pre-internet age was some kind of golden era where people all held hands and skipped around in meadows. The whole course of human history is often a story of people dehumanizing and demonizing and hating one another, and then subsequently doing awful things to each other. The internet is merely one step in this much longer walk, rather than originating a totally new phenomenon. The philosopher David Livingstone Smith has spent much of his career trying to form a theory of dehumanization and collective hate more generally. He's trying to figure out why we do it, through what mechanisms, how to study it, and ultimately how to stop it. He freely admits that his conclusions are tentative, but they are clearly insightful, and in my opinion, they're onto something. Smith argues that humans have a series of built-in mechanisms which allow us to kind of exile certain people from the circle of our moral consideration, and to then instinctively treat them as a different species, or akin to a different species. At the very least, treat them as something quite alien from ourselves. His work largely deals with analysing historical atrocities and the extremities of dehumanization and dehumanized violence, such as those found during extreme global conflict. But I can't see any reason to think that this tendency towards moral exile only comes in extreme forms. Smith points out that, on a more general level, we have a tendency towards essentializing people and essentializing groups of people. That is, thinking that these people have some kind of unseen essence that is incredibly important and they can be judged by it, but is separable from their behavior or how they appear to us. He uses this in his analysis of why those who participate in violent conflict often describe their enemies as looking human, but in some sense not being human. But we also do this when we essentialize people into being just evil or just good, or, in simpler terms, one of us and one of them. The reason for this, according to Smith, is that we are highly social animals, and this comes with numerous advantages, including moral advantages, but also it comes with a potential for tribal conflict. The word potential here is important. Smith isn't a fatalist. He's not arguing that we will always inevitably end up in such conflicts, but rather that there is a pre-existing tendency within us that allows for these conflicts to develop, and it will take active effort on our part to prevent them from doing so. Thus, to the extent that the internet plays into these tendencies, we should see it as facilitating a pre-existing thing, rather than originating something substantially new, and that should keep us away from moral panic territory. Smith also gives us a series of things to look out for when we are studying things like tribal conflicts and dehumanization. They include pretty obvious things like metaphors which compare a group of people to animals or other subhuman creatures, but also a tendency to generalize about them beyond what is justified, declaring that all X are like this, and stubbornly maintaining it even in the face of contrary evidence. He often talks about the extremity of the rhetoric used, whereby morally nullifying emotions like anger or fear are used to convince people that they must act now to prevent a particular threat. And those emotions are, in a sense, used to deactivate what would normally prevent people from treating others in a dehumanized or otherwise inhumane manner. Obviously, Smith is writing in the context of actual physical violence, and often in the extreme forms of that, so his observations aren't going to totally cohere with the online sphere. However, I do think there is a remarkable correspondence between the kind of speech he argues encourages conflict and dehumanization and the kind of speech that is, at the very least, incentivized online. This is because both are intentionally shocking and intentionally invoke moral outrage, and thus produce in their listeners strong motivation to engage with the statement. As has been pointed out by many people, myself included, the algorithms which control what we normally see online are set to maximize engagement rather than to maximize happiness or interpersonal cohesion or lovely stuff like that. And statements that induce anger or fear just are more likely to engage us. If you need an example, then you can probably find one in the title of this video. But this can then produce a self-intensifying effect. Since you need to be more emotionally grabbing than the video next to you in order to stand out, then the stakes must only ever be getting higher. Something can't just be a problem, it must be the end of the world as we know it. There can't be challenges, there can only be apocalypses. And there can't be mere differences, there have to be outright threats. Thankfully, I think there is some backlash to this now in the user base, and I think people are consciously choosing to watch less emotionally catastrophizing content as a kind of rebellion against this algorithmic feed. But it is still swimming upstream against both the algorithm itself and the deeper instincts within us that wish to be aware of these potential threats or aware of reasons to be angry. And this anger can be even more effective if it is directed at a designated outgroup, since then you also get the warm, fuzzy feeling that comes from being part of the in-group, and you signal your in-group loyalty to the other people around you. Moreover, the specific kinds of emotion that perform well on social media are morally laden ones. This is what separates mere anger from its more moralistic cousin, outrage. A 2021 meta-analysis by Brady and Van Bavel found that morally laden emotions directly correlate with greater engagement online. A further article by Van Bavel and others argue that these moral emotions can also cement in-group bonding and intensify out-group animosity. Or, in layman's terms, they can encourage us to like what is us and hate what is them. As they put it, research suggests that dunking on out-group members is a strong predictor of engagement on social media, as divisive content is more likely to go viral. Indeed, mentioning an outgroup member is the strongest predictor of social media engagement out of a variety of predictors measured in an analysis of Facebook and Twitter posts by politicians and partisan news media sources. Outgroup language in particular predicts angry and ha-ha reactions, indicating that mentions of the outgroup may be closely linked to emotions such as anger, contempt, or mockery. In other words, shaming or ridiculing political opponents appears to be a key driver of engagement on social media. Furthermore, there is evidence that such moral outrage is contagious. In 2012, some data scientists at Facebook ran an experiment whereby a pretty large group of users were shown fewer negative posts and more positive posts than usual for a set period of time, and they in turn posted less negative content themselves. This suggests that the algorithmic prioritization of negatively affective content will in turn cause other users to make more of it. This example is from a paper by Nathan Wildman et al., who used the term affective manipulation to characterize this phenomenon. They argue that it strips us of quite an important kind of autonomy by putting our affects and emotions significantly in the hands of other people and platforms. All of this means that when we are online, we are not being exposed to a fair cross-section of the population or a fair cross-section of statements. We're being exposed to those that are pre-selected to fuel our moral anger and our tribal instincts, for lack of a better term. But I'm sure that you probably knew a fair amount of that already, though I hope this has clarified some of the mechanisms and some of the things we can say about it. The interesting thing for me is how the hatred created by this system gets kind of locked in and begins to erode the underlying assumptions which make the exchange of ideas possible. In order to have a good discussion with someone where either you or they might change your mind, you have to believe a couple of things. The first is that they're not severely epistemically misguided in their views. And the second is that they have your moral respect as an agent and as a speaker. That is, roughly speaking, you believe that they are approaching the discussion in some degree of good faith, and that you, within the context of the discussion, are working towards a shared goal, which might be to find truth, or improve the country, or improve the world, or just to become slightly wiser. This is what the philosopher Elizabeth Edenberg calls the moral respect required for discourse. For her, resolving disagreements, or even having disagreements that don't boil over into complete division, requires that we believe the person disagreeing with us is not totally morally deficient. That is, they might have different information to us or different priorities, but they're not so alien as to be morally unintelligible or so morally different to us to be a direct enemy. As Edinburgh says, we must see our opponents as morally decent, even if we deeply disagree or think they're misguided. She's talking largely in the realm of politics, but the lesson applies much more widely than this. The trouble is that if dehumanizing and moral anger-inducing rhetoric is incentivized online, and I think we've established that it at least somewhat is, then it works directly to undermine the kind of moral respect that Edinburgh thinks is central to productive disagreement. We're encouraged not to see those we disagree with as people with understandable views, even if we think those views are incorrect, but as things like animals or mindless forces or infections. There's not the sense that we might, at least in principle, figure out where they're coming from. Opposition is presented as unintelligible, and if views are not even intelligible, then there's no point in trying to discuss them or disagree about them. You wouldn't disagree with a virus or a natural disaster, you would just either work to destroy it or to mitigate its damage. Again, this is by no means a problem unique to social media. It is a continual temptation of being human, and you can definitely see the same tendency in pre-social media news cycles, or before that, in the literary genre of the polemic. But what was previously the purview of the polemicist or the pundit is now something we can all do and all access at any time. And when there is so much more competition for eyes and clicks, the emotional stakes continue to grow, while moral outrage is such a powerful driver of attention. Hi, it's Joe from the future here. I just wanted to chime in because I came across another article by Van Bavel, this time on his fantastic Substack, where he talks about the tyranny of the online minority. In effect, he points out that not only is animosity-inducing content online more likely to spread, it then thus begins to affect how we view the offline world more generally. Because we're often presented with a skewed sample of the most vitriolic or ridiculous content out there, we enter into what he calls the funhouse mirror version of the world, where we think people are generally much more aggressive and have more controversial views than they actually do. The most controversial content filters to the top, but that then distorts how we view the offline world, making it seem far more hostile than it actually is, and so perpetuating this kind of vicious, animosity-inducing spiral. But anyway, back to Past Joe. In effect, what we have here is a situation that the philosopher C.T. Nguyen calls value capture. In a paper largely on the subject of Twitter, but also on social media more generally, Nguyen points out that the metrics of success on social media platforms, often in terms of likes or shares or comments, create an implicit set of success conditions for our activities on that website. If something gets many views and many likes and many shares and many comments, then it is good in the publicly accessible metric of success. This transforms every interaction on social media into something vaguely resembling a public speaking contest. On the one hand, it's a back and forth interaction, but on the other hand, there is an incentive to play to the crowd, and there's always this third party watching. And as we've discussed, one of the best ways, and certainly one of the easiest ways, to achieve these metrics is to incite moral anger and fear. Moreover, as Nguyen points out, these kinds of visible metrics can very easily capture someone who previously didn't care about them at all. You might initially use a social media platform as an earnest way to engage with others, but things like likes and shares are just so much easier to access and assess that they can quickly supplant the initial goal. I mean, think of all the YouTube creators who slowly get audience captured and can no longer express their own opinions or interests anymore. Their actual goals have become eclipsed by seductively visible metrics of success. And I think this definitely happens even to people who aren't making a direct monetary income online. But I do want to be clear here. I'm not saying that social media necessitates any of these things. There are ways of using social media that mitigate or avoid all of these factors, and I'm hoping we'll come on to some of those later. However, as it stands, we are straining against the inertia of the platform when we do this. Instead of social media directly implying this kind of animosity, it is better to think of it as the default mode of algorithmic engagement as it currently exists. But I've so far been dancing around quite a key term in arguments like this, and that is the echo chamber. And that's because I wanted to give it its own section, because it turns out it is a surprisingly controversial and complex idea. 2. Echo chambers and rationality. The way we talk about echo chambers has changed an awful lot over the past decade or so. It used to just be received wisdom that your content feed, which will gradually personalize itself to you, would eventually insulate you from ever encountering opinions that you disagreed with. If you were on a particular political side of YouTube, you would just never come across alternative perspectives. This was thought to account for a large degree of how people became so divided online, most notably in politics, but you could apply the same reasoning almost anywhere. But then, when the phenomenon was actually studied, it was found that people actually are exposed to content that disagrees with them quite a lot. The so-called echo chambers seem to be a myth, or at the very least, people actively opted into them rather than it being an algorithmic artifact. A great literature review by Arguedas et al. Found that most people accessed at least some media from opposing viewpoints. As they put it, most people have diverse media diets. Those who rely on only one source typically converge on large sources with politically diverse audiences, such as commercial or public service broadcasters, and only small minorities, often only a few percent, exclusively get news from partisan sources. For a long time, I just kind of accepted this new finding and figured that echo chambers were a myth or not a widespread concern. However, I was recently reading another paper by C.T. Nguyen, which argues that when echo chambers were disproven by this empirical research, they were, in an important sense, looking at the wrong thing. When we talked about echo chambers back in the day, we used the term rather widely, and Nguyen argues that we conflated two quite different phenomena, only one of which was later empirically disproven. The kind of thing that has been disproven is an algorithmically driven epistemic bubble. Epistemic bubbles are when we are just isolated from particular sources of information or particular perspectives. This occurs naturally, literally all the time. If I'd grown up in a household that largely listens to jazz, I would not have encountered the wonderful Canadian rock band Rush, and vice versa. To use a less silly example, I once met someone who grew up in a highly religious community and household. He didn't encounter arguments against the existence of God until he was an adult. There is probably a sense in which we all inhabit various different epistemic bubbles, simply because we are unlikely to be able to consider every plausible option on the table. There's a whole lot of information out there and only a limited number of hours in the day. Damn you, frail morality. However, Nguyen points out that echo chambers can't just be epistemic bubbles, because epistemic bubbles are by their nature rather fragile and not even necessarily that destructive. Let's pretend that I grew up thinking that the Earth was flat, not in a modern-day flat Earth community, just that I happened to think it was flat for whatever reason. Since my pretend family also thought the Earth was flat, I was never exposed to the idea that the Earth was round until I got to school. But at the same time, this hypothetical me was never made to feel hostile towards the idea that the Earth was round. I wasn't told there were round Earthers who were waiting to trick me into accepting the globe hypothesis, nor was I told there was a conspiracy to cover up the idea that the Earth was flat. I just happened to have never come across the idea. I was in an epistemic bubble. Since I would have no hostility towards the idea that the Earth were round, when I encountered good evidence for the Earth being round, I would be quite likely to change my mind. I think we've all done this sort of thing at one point or another, though probably not with the Earth's shape. I used to think that the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God was sound and good, and then I was exposed to strong arguments against it, and I changed my mind. Merely not having encountered a piece of information is insufficient to create the negative, perspective-limiting effects of an echo chamber. So, what is an echo chamber according to Nguyen? Well, he argues that what makes an echo chamber special is the attitude those within it take towards opposing perspectives. In an echo chamber, you may be exposed to different ideas, but those ideas will almost always be unjustly discredited in advance. This, he says, is the kind of thing that we should be looking out for online. Take an echo chamber that I am a bit familiar with, since I dipped into it a little last year to research for a couple of videos. This is the online manifestation community. These are groups of people who genuinely do believe that when you alter your thoughts, you alter your spiritual frequency, and you will attract certain events and objects towards you via the law of attraction. I don't just mean people who think that changing your thoughts will affect your actions, which will in turn affect the world, because nobody questions that. I mean people who believe that thoughts directly affect reality through an intangible metaphysical law. A common talking point in the forums that I visited was that people outside the community would try to tell you that it doesn't work. But, importantly, you must not listen to them because they will sabotage your efforts. Sometimes there was an element of spiritual elitism involved, with those who believed in manifestation simply belonging to a higher spiritual type than the rest of us who don't have the imagination to believe. Thus, when someone from these communities encountered someone who disbelieved or who challenged them, they had a ready-made set of responses with which to dismiss them. For Nguyen, this is the key factor in an echo chamber. An echo chamber instills in its members reasons for rejecting legitimate alternative perspectives when they do in fact encounter them. In political spheres, this is often done by telling a series of stories about the other side, such as that they are all acting in bad faith or have been corrupted by nefarious elements, in some case literally Satan himself, or that they are just irredeemably bad people who come from a different moral universe to your good self, and with whom conversations are thus impossible or counterproductive. Recall our last section and the issue of moral respect in dialogue. Either way, these are blanket reasons that are given to disregard any dissenting view in advance of hearing it. This notably does not require that the person be isolated from opposing information, just that they are insulated internally from being persuaded by it. Thus, echo chambers aren't really spaces per se, not even online spaces. They are found within the epistemic attitudes of certain agents who've been exposed to certain information presented in a certain way. Thus, while epistemic bubbles might be relatively rare online, I think that echo chambers, in the manner that Nguyen describes, may be a bit more common, though of course further empirical research would have to be done here. I think that they might be more common for two key reasons. Firstly, the ready-made stories that echo chambers provide are much easier to use on people that we don't know very well. It's easier to believe that a faceless person I've never met and have only engaged with online is a moral monster or an idiot or has been tricked by some malevolent force than it is to believe those same things about my real-life friends and family. For people we know in any depth, it is difficult to deny that they are multidimensional, and it's much more difficult to reduce them down to either an evil bastard or a mindless puppet. But with online encounters, we often have no independent evidence that the people we are arguing with are not these things, and so the ready-made dismissal story can be deployed basically automatically. Secondly, contentious issues online often coalesce around creators who represent opposing camps. I've even noticed this a little bit myself. I am often introduced as an agnostic or an atheist YouTuber or something like that, even though only a tiny minority of my videos are even about religion or theism. I've talked about literature a hell of a lot more. I think I've actually got more videos simply on Nietzsche and Dostoevsky than I have on the whole topic of philosophy of religion. But because it's one of the mainstream cultural disagreements that I have waded into, it's kind of stuck to me. I can only imagine how easy it is to be pigeonholed into a particular view and then disincentivized from changing your mind if your whole channel was about politics or some either highly contentious and controversial subject. In such a scenario, your whole livelihood might actually rest on you holding a particular set of positions, and this does incentivize you to simply never change your mind on them. The easiest way to safeguard yourself from change here is to practice one of these blanket discrediting maneuvers, since then the threat is neutralized. But then you've kind of done two things. The first is that you yourself have fallen into an echo chamber, and the second is that you've transformed your audience into an echo chamber itself. And given the efficacy of echo chamber techniques on strangers and the prevalence of stranger-to-stranger interactions online, we now have a baker-made recipe for highly effective echo chambers. Again, I want to kind of re-emphasize here that this is just a hypothesis. It would need to be checked, but I do think that all of the pieces are there to make it, at the very least, a plausible hypothesis, one that is worth testing. Moreover, if this is true, we can't simply solve it by getting better at critical thinking or practicing abstract cognitive skills. Those things might help a little, and I still think they're worth learning, but they don't really get to the meat and potatoes of the issue. Because, as Nguyen points out, once you're in an echo chamber, even following what is generally good epistemic practice can lead you further into the echo chamber. For example, it's very good practice not to engage with those who argue in bad faith, because you'll just waste your time and you're not going to get anywhere with them anyway. As they say, never play chess with a pigeon. But if you've been convinced that whole swaths of the general population are inevitably acting in bad faith, then this normally good rule will lead you astray. Likewise, because the people within your echo chamber will have predicted that there would be dissent from outsiders and that they would not be able to see your point of view, the voices within the echo chamber give you more reasons to trust them as reliable, since they've now made a novel prediction that was later confirmed by experience. For Nguyen, this is what is so pernicious and so difficult about echo chambers. Once we are in one, that initial error in judgment means that further attempts to act in line with generally sound epistemic practice will backfire and will instead entrench our unjustified position. This in turn will make it more difficult to step outside the echo chamber in future. So it's a kind of spiral towards disastrous certainty. As Nguyen puts it, echo chambers are local background conditions that turn generally good epistemic practices into locally unreliable ones. Thus, although many algorithms do not totally isolate us from dissenting viewpoints, the general dynamics at play on social media can lead us into this other kind of echo chamber, where you don't need to isolate someone from dissent, because any dissent they encounter is already discredited in advance. Even anecdotally, we can see that mere isolation is insufficient for embedding someone in their own perspective, but that discrediting can be sufficient. Think of how many political creators spend their time reacting to those who disagree with them and arguing with them on the fly. Many of these seem like quintessential echo chambers, but they are in fact predicated specifically on exposing the viewer to disagreeing content in order to then find ways to dismiss it. Again, it's important to bear in mind here that this didn't originate with the internet. Echo chambers are probably as old as things like ideas and society. But the internet gives them pretty fertile breeding ground, and I think they go some way to explaining why it is so difficult to have conversations online. Moreover, echo chambers often tie directly back into that lack of moral respect we talked about earlier regarding those who disagree with us. It's important not to generalize too far. The point is that not everyone online is just in an echo chamber, and it's not clear the echo chambers are merely algorithmically driven, but I do think they are an important part of what is causing animosity online, and ultimately what causes us to seemingly hate one another more with every passing year. Nguyen argues that if we want to combat our own internal echo chambers, then we'll have to undertake a philosophical exercise that's not actually that unlike the one that Descartes did when he decided to doubt every one of his beliefs to discover what he could be certain of. Echo chambers, for Nguyen, are inseparable from the order in which someone receives information. That is, we must receive the story which pre-discredits the opposition first before we actually encounter that opposition in real life. So, to break out of the echo chamber, we would need to temporarily try to suspend our beliefs and then pretend that we encountered the information in a totally different order and see whether we would change our mind in any significant ways. Does the discrediting story still seem justified? And if not, why not? Nguyen is pretty clear this is quite a difficult thing to do, but it probably just is a pretty good exercise for us all to do at some point. Because one of the most pernicious things about an echo chamber is that when you're in one, you don't think you have a pre-discrediting story. You just think you're being reasonable and everyone else is wrong, misguided, or evil. But we touched upon the topic of strangers in this section, and I actually want to talk about that in a bit more detail, because I think it will really help us understand a key factor in why it's so easy to hate one another online. And maybe even offer one potential route forwards. 3. Anonymity and manners. It's basically cliche at this point to talk about how anonymity on the internet contributes to the general difficulty of having amiable conversations. So the theory goes, When we are anonymous, we don't feel responsible for our actions, or don't feel as responsible, since we can't be held accountable to a stable-ish identity. The rate at which we can change our behavior and perceive characteristics online is just so much higher than in the offline world, so we can pick up and put down identities roughly as we please. I could have 3 separate Twitter accounts, one where I masquerade as a radical medievalist wanting us all to return to the norms of 13th century England, one where I present myself as an arch-progressive, and another where I seem like a techno-futurist. And from the outside, no one can hold me to the usual norms of consistency that we would expect of someone's behavior and expressed viewpoints, because there's no way of identifying any of these 3 profiles as me, or seeing that they belong to the same person. One interesting comment made by Whitney Phillips, who spent years of her life studying and interviewing online trolls, is that trolls often tended to separate themselves from their anonymous or pseudonymous profiles. They would often have Facebook accounts under fake names and would make reference to what their profile did that day, or otherwise refer to their online activities in the third person, as if they had not done it, but some other mysterious agent had, similar to how an actor will treat themselves and their character as 2 separate entities. But of course, it's justified in the case of the actor, and it's not justified in the case of the troll. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who I've mentioned a lot on the channel before, also connects the transitory nature of online identities to the strange character of online discourse. Much of his book, In the Swarm, is about the fact that things on the internet, despite staying around forever, are not lasting in the way that in-person events often are. An important memory that I have of a friend, or a heated disagreement with someone I know, or an organized political community working after a definite goal might stick around for a long time, either in my memory or public memory, or just physically. But your average online discourse cycle often lasts a very short amount of time, and at least part of that time is taken up with the ironic reflection on the discourse cycle, where people often conclude it wasn't that deep in the first place. You could challenge Hahn's findings empirically here. I myself wonder if in-person events are not just as transitory, but since there's often no permanent mark of an insignificant in-person event in the way that there is online, we're just not around to notice its transitoriness, if that makes sense. But I do think that Hahn is onto something when he talks about the transitory nature of online identities, especially when someone is anonymous or pseudonymous or uses a variety of pseudonymous profiles. I think this does affect our behavior, and it does affect the shape of discourse. Additionally, beyond any concerns about anonymity and our sense of responsibility towards our online actions, we are also just deprived of so much helpful information when we interact online, which we would normally have in face-to-face conversations. Most online interactions are over text, and we don't have access to tone of voice or body language or the myriad other things that we just automatically process in ordinary interactions. Moreover, in a 2023 study, Brady et al. Found that people tend to overperceive that moral outrage we were talking about earlier in online interactions, meaning that they infer more moral outrage on the part of the speaker than that speaker intended. Of course, more research is needed to confirm whether this holds for other emotions, but it may indicate a kind of negativity bias in how we process online interactions, often over-inferring negative intent. And this is related to how little information we have about the people we are often interacting with online. And something that I think is so closely connected with this, and yet also something I rarely see mentioned in our conversations about it, is the importance and function of manners. It's kind of a bit weird to speak about the benefits of politeness nowadays. Politeness seems to be perceived mostly as an obstacle, something that stands in the way of authenticity. But I think this has made us far less aware of what manners and politeness often do. Yes, the details are kind of arbitrary in that we say please and thank you rather than gavagi and gavargo, and we shake hands when we could have just as easily performed a little dance routine. But the actual function of manners is not arbitrary at all. Among other things, being polite lets a stranger know that you mean them no harm, either physically or reputationally, and are willing to expend a little bit of effort, however small, for their sake. And sure, it's not a perfect system. I'm British. I am so used to encountering people who are incredibly adept at using manners as finely honed weapons of passive aggression. But I do think that it can help things. Think about how differently you would view a person who smiled and shook your hand and told you it was nice to meet you versus someone who frowned at you, kept their hand by their side when you offered to shake, and didn't even ask your name. You would probably view the latter as more hostile and would have worse odds of having a pleasant and productive conversation with him. And obviously, this is in a particular context. An acquaintance of mine is from the inner city in Chicago, and when she's home, she will much more naturally reach for a fist bump as a polite greeting, at least according to her. A friend of mine who works in Japan is now much more used to bowing rather than shaking hands, but the overall point still stands. These tiny scripts help us to grease the wheels of talking to a stranger, and without them, that process would be significantly harder. And I think this is relevant because internet discourse is partly noteworthy because it almost exclusively involves interactions between strangers or near strangers. There are exceptions to this, such as small, stable online communities where people have reliable identities and get to know one another, but those are, by and large, not what we're referring to when we talk about internet discourse being broken or the internet encouraging us to hate one another. Instead, we are largely talking about conversations and interactions between those who didn't know one another prior to first engagement, even if, in the context of certain influencer feuds, they may have watched some of one another's content. I kind of want to single this out because when people fall out when they actually know one another, I don't think there's anything necessarily mysterious going on. People fall out all the time. The interesting features of online discourse are largely in the stranger-to-stranger interactions, and those interactions are far more common online than they are in everyday offline life. However, we have also not really settled on many politeness norms for online communication, and there's not an awful lot of incentive to follow regular manners protocol. Firstly, because rage-baiting content just travels further, so if your goal is exposure, then there's a strong incentive just not to be polite. But also because internet discourse doesn't behave like ordinary conversations. When someone comments on something or replies to someone, they don't say hello or introduce themselves or do any of the pre-conversation warm-up that we're used to in face-to-face engagement. It almost has the feeling of butting into a conversation midstream. Furthermore, the overall culture of internet discourse, in as much as such a thing exists, and at least only in English, because that's only the language that I can judge, is shaped by our glorification of authenticity, which, as we've discussed, is often perceived as opposed to manners and politeness. The anonymity we mentioned earlier also means there are few social costs incurred by being rude, since even if your profile gained a reputation for being impolite, you could just start a new one. It's no major stress. So we have a situation where the number of strangers we interact with is higher than it's ever been, while at the same time, we have those interactions in a context that is pretty much totally deprived of all of our usual tools that help stranger-to-stranger interactions go smoothly. What could possibly go wrong? There are, of course, no easy solutions here, but in the absence of these little politeness rituals that we use in offline life, I think that we should shift our manner of talking to be significantly more gentle if we want our online interactions to go well. Over the years, I've done a bit of personal testing with this approach by making various anonymous accounts on Reddit and Twitter and other social media platforms and engaging in various political disagreements, as well as in other heated areas of debate. And I found that people were a lot more cooperative when I began my statements like this. I may be wrong, but perhaps I'm misunderstanding you, but I think, just to help me understand, could you clarify term X? I can see where you're coming from. It just seems to me that it is an overly decorous way of speaking that I would not use in real life among people I knew unless I were worried about a particularly sensitive person or were challenging someone who knew much more about a topic than I did. Many of these statements are forms of epistemic hedging, where we clarify that we are not certain we're right before we begin speaking. I found that people were far more likely to respond fairly positively when I used phrases like this than when I didn't. In subsequent comments in the thread where we would disagree further, I could somewhat drop them since we'd already had a few positive interactions that then framed the interpretations of the later ones. And as a bonus, I kind of think this epistemic hedging is also often appropriate, given our tendency to overestimate our own knowledge and our own intellectual competence. The kind of confidence with which people put forward propositions online just can't be warranted most of the time. I do not believe that the internet is chock full of people who have done exhaustive research on everything that they say. Thus, the kind of epistemic hedging that would allow our interactions to go more smoothly would also, almost as a happy accident, probably bring us closer in line to the kind of expressed uncertainty that is appropriate for us. But this is only a preliminary idea. I suspect that what we really need is a set of reliable norms that define what politeness means online, but I'm just somewhat doubtful whether it is possible for such norms to be created in any detail or find lasting stability, considering the points Han makes about the fleetingness and instability of online engagement. Depending on whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, you might see this as a problem to solve or an unfortunate fact of mass communication with strangers that is permanent and here to stay. But either way, it outlines yet another problem that stands in the way of productive conversations online, and yet another way in which animosity is engendered by the structure of our online spaces. But finally, I actually want to end the video by pushing back on some of what I've said so far and trying to link these problems of the internet to more general problems of humanity. 4. The task of love and the future of the internet. I've mentioned a couple of times over the course of this video that I'm very keen for it not to drift into a form of moral panic where we begin to blame the internet and only the internet for our animosity towards one another. There is this underlying assumption in that framing that the natural human state is one of great mutual love, and that this is somehow an aberration from that trend. But I think this can make the task of loving our fellow human being seem far easier than it actually is. To repurpose an observation that David Courtwright made in his book The Age of Addiction, the internet does not tend to create new tendencies within us, it tends to amplify the sometimes ugly potential that is already there. At the moment, I'm reading The Brothers Karamazov with my Substack subscribers, and as a result, I have a lot of Dostoevsky and that book in particular sort of floating around my brain at the moment. In one of the earliest scenes in the novel, the elder Zosima observes that it's often quite easy to love mankind in the abstract, but it's far more difficult to take each individual person, flawed and imperfect and possibly infuriating as they are, and love them in full knowledge of those flaws. If I allowed myself to be wildly hopeful, then I might say that the internet as it currently exists has presented us with a grand existential task. The task of seeing some of the worst aspects of humanity relentlessly publicized, but nonetheless not losing our faith in one another or coming to hate one another, but managing to bear in mind the complexity and ultimate lovability of the people who only present themselves to us as cantankerous text on our screens. I have no idea if this would ever work at scale. I suspect that it wouldn't. But for those of us who do want to actively try to love mankind more, the algorithmic structure of the internet could act a little bit like running with weights on. However, just as it could train our love for one another if we really strove to use it in this way, left to its own devices as it currently stands, it will stoke our hatred. That being said, I also don't want to blame the technology itself. There is nothing about the bare bones of the internet as a whole that necessitates these kinds of hate-filled incentives. It is a contingent feature of the way the internet is currently organized. There are many subsections of the internet, for example, that allow us to connect with one another and allow us to find community. It is, again, far too easy just to write off the internet as a whole as evil, instead of trying to rework it to promote human flourishing rather than to diminish it. I say this because, although I do have many issues with the internet as it exists today, I also have a deep affection for it. It's allowed me to learn so much more than would have ever been possible without it. Some of my favorite philosophy papers I've just stumbled upon by chance while scrolling through Phil papers. The internet contains the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the Gutenberg Press, two of the greatest educational websites for philosophy, and in the case of the Gutenberg Press, far beyond philosophy, ever created. I don't think the answer is to throw all of this away because of the internet's bad aspects. If anything, these sites and silos of sanity should be a signal as to what the rest of the internet could aspire to be. My problem with laying too much blame at the feet of the internet as if it's some abstract, malevolent entity is that it is far too easy. It lets us off the hook. We can think of ways that we might alter internet structures to be better and not foster such animosity, but that too is not the whole story. Because, as I said at the beginning of the video, The internet is just the last in a long line of social and material technologies that exploit and exacerbate our propensity to hate and attempt to divide humanity into camps of essential allies and essential enemies. It is still we who choose to take up this hatred and who indulge those instincts rather than quelling them or redirecting them. I am all for technological reform, but I want us to combine it with the kind of introspective effort that allows us to better understand when we do fall into hatred or extreme anger or outrage, and then allows us to nip it in the bud. Because the whole internet could go up in smoke tomorrow, and there would still be people trying to use this propensity for hatred and violence within us for their own gain. Having said all that, I also think it's important not to fall into internet defeatism. Since we only see the internet as it currently exists, it's very easy to imagine that there is no alternative way we could set up this technology or use it. But that's simply not true. For one thing, as I've said, we do have control over how we use the internet. We can do our utmost to ensure that we are polite and loving online, and so attempt to be an example. But beyond this, we don't have to simply lay back and accept this current algorithmic setup. I don't know anything about technology law, so I'm not just going to march in and propose legal changes. But I just want us to recognize that there are other ways the online world can be, and we shouldn't forget that or accept defeat in the face of our current online problems. And the thinkers we've looked at today can give us some pointers here. Le Guin lets us know that whatever this future internet should be like, it probably shouldn't boil success down into a set of easily visible metrics that are all built around maximizing our attention and our emotional engagement, at least if we want to minimize this animosity. From Edinburgh, we learn that it should try to encourage a sense of mutual moral regard in its users, and our observations about manners and politeness may help with that. It should, if possible, avoid creating echo chambers where myths and discrediting stories that reduce that mutual moral and epistemic respect can proliferate like rats. And all of this should be tempered with the observations by Livingston Smith that thoughts of utopias where hatred is quieted forever are incredibly unlikely. Originally, I was going to end the video there, but it struck me when I was writing that last paragraph that some of these recommendations may even be in tension with one another. For instance, creating a sense of mutual moral regard is far easier if we are interacting in established communities, but established communities raise the risk of also being echo chambers. Getting rid of anonymity would probably encourage us to be more polite, but it would also expose our personal details to those who, in accordance with Smith's observations, might be disposed to hate and dehumanize us and then cause us harm. Of course, we don't want crude, value-capturing metrics, but any attempt to reduce animosity-inducing content at scale will probably involve identifying it with an algorithm, and that will mean translating a delicate and context-dependent human concept into contextless data. What begins with very good intentions could easily tip over into unreasonable censorship. And all of this means that, in my view, planning the future of the internet will involve a couple of things. First, it will involve balancing these tensions incredibly carefully without giving in totally to any particular one. And secondly, it will almost certainly involve subspaces where the weightings of these factors will be slightly different. We talk about the future of the internet as if the internet is one thing, but as it currently exists, it consists of millions of subspaces, and the same will almost certainly be true of any future iteration of it. This gives us another dimension along which to begin thinking and imagining. Of course, these observations about balancing different tensions and creating subspaces are kind of the same problems faced by in-person groups when we try to coordinate any sort of behavior at scale. It's the same issue that lawmakers face when they're trying to balance the competing interests of many different groups and many different factors, or small-scale community leaders face when they're attempting to prevent people with vastly different interests or preferences from having to spend too much time together, because that will probably tip over into group conflict. So, once again, we see that the division between the problems of the internet and the problems of just human sociability more generally are neither hard nor fast. The internet is not the bogeyman. It's an enormous version of the perennial problems that emerge whenever humans interact with one another at scale. It's just that, in this case, the scale is truly unprecedented, and so these problems take on new and nuanced and twisted forms. I obviously don't know how to fix the internet, but researching this video, as well as a few others that I've made in the past year, has convinced me that this is one of the most worthwhile areas for philosophers to be working on today. It remains a pretty niche interest in academia, but I'd really like that to change. Already, reading the works of people like Nguyen and Hahn and Edinburgh have altered the way I have thought about the internet and my attitude towards it. Historically, one of the things philosophy has done, at least when it's been functioning at its best, is create new ways to think about something, forge new concepts with which to analyze it, refine and specify existing ideas, and hopefully imagine ways that things could be used slightly differently and hopefully more productively. The internet is an invention of unimaginable significance. And yet the philosophy of the internet remains exiled to the fringes. I think this is, frankly speaking, insane. And I would genuinely encourage every person watching this video to spend some time doing your own philosophy on the subject of the internet. Try to apply a thinker you're already familiar with to its dynamics, or reflect on your own experience online and analyze those observations. Is there a new concept that needs to be introduced to accommodate some peculiarity of online life? Well, if so, try and create and refine and specify it. I highly doubt there's going to be a final grand philosophy of the internet, and I don't really know what such a thing would even look like. But I do think that our current conceptual apparatus requires further innovation if we are going to reflect and philosophize on the internet with utility and precision. That, in my view, is not something that one person can do. It will emerge out of the numerous hypotheses, anecdotes, reflections, and theories that just occur when you have a large number of people working on something with focus. So I think that's what we should do, particularly inside academic philosophy, but also outside of it. And I know it's unsatisfying to end a video with the conclusion that there is much further work that needs to be done, and I would love to tie everything together into a neat solution right now. But that would be artificial, and more importantly, it would just be falsifying. The truth is that while we are making philosophical progress in understanding the internet, we need to go a lot further. The internet may not fall into classic philosophical fields like metaphysics or epistemology or ethics or logic, but it is too important a development to pass philosophy by. The thinkers we looked at today provide a very, very promising place for us to start, but by no means do they represent an ending. But one thing people often say is that the internet or phones have damaged their focus. And if you want to hear my take on that issue, then you can watch it right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.